All right, good morning, everybody. Yeah, oh, what a great day. Good morning, Thornton Campus Crossroads, and good morning, Fort Lupton Campus Crossroads. And if you're joining us online at some point, we're really happy that you're with us today. This last Sunday, this last weekend in 2019, we actually step into a brand new decade on Wednesday, and we're excited, right? Are we excited? Yeah, we're excited. There's good things. Well, here I am preaching my very last message as the senior pastor of Crossroads Church. Over the last number of months, people have asked me, are you excited about retiring from your position here? And I usually tell them that I'm very excited. I'm excited for what I'm retiring out of, but more excited about what I'm retiring into, my new role at Crossroads Church, which will be it'll be an important role, but a much a more minor one in relationship to leadership for the church, but important one in leadership to residents. I'll be directing our new pastoral residency program. It'll be a part-time deal that I will be so honored to be able to work with residents right out of seminary, working with them. Our first one on the ground here in May, and we're excited about that. And it'll change, really, their lives and our life as a church, I believe. I'm excited about working with our region in our pastor-to-pastor program. I've been asked to do that, encouraging pastors throughout our region of 80 churches, and I found that very, very beneficial and very exciting and very encouraging for me to be able to travel around our region and do that, and I'll be doing more of that. As well, my third angle or arm of ministry and mission that I'm working on and have been, as you know, is a little bike shop that I operate called More Better Bikes, and it helps people get on bikes that can't afford them, and we help dozens and dozens of people all the time, and I'd love for you to go look at what we do at morebetterbikes.com. Well, I'm retiring out of leading this church, but I'm retiring into mission and ministry that God has uniquely prepared me for over these years. But I'm also excited about what I am stepping aside to allow to happen, what that's going to do for our church. God has been so gracious over the years to grow, along with myself, this amazing crew of staff, both volunteers and paid staff, with such skill and vision and courage and wisdom. I'm very excited about our future, and I'm very humbled to have been a part of it for these last years. I'm very grateful to our leaders who are stepping into and now leading our church and have been. I never dreamed that back in August of 1982, nearly 38 years ago, coming to this church would lead to all this. So for my last official senior pastor sermon, I'd like to offer you what I'm calling my I Never Dreamed sermon. There's a famous sermon that's close to that name, but it's nowhere near that. This is my I Never Dreamed speech. And it starts, if you'll indulge me, back in high school, at Northglenn High School, just down the road from where I'm standing right now, back in 1975, the greatest class on earth. Just after the crust of the earth began to cool, I graduated from high school. And I met three people in high school that, upon reflection, I realized changed my life. Now, I didn't always like high school. I enjoyed college much more. But high school, as I look back, was a time, I wonder if you'd look back with me as I walk you through this little journey. In high school, three people that changed my life to this very day. I'd like to mention them to you. The first one is a young man, he played the trumpet, named Randy Barnett. He invited me to a concert at his church, Village Baptist Church. I must have been 16, going on to 17 years old. He wanted me to hear his youth choir sing, a choir named Celebration. I ended up joining that choir, and believe it or not, that's where I met Jesus when I was 17 years old. My parents were great to raise my brother, my sister, myself in a very Christian home. But for whatever reason, I never realized that God wanted to have a relationship with me through Jesus until I heard that message at Village Baptist Church when I was 17 years old. I gave my heart to Jesus at that time. And it came in part due to a song that the choir sang based on an old poem out of 1926 by Dr. James Allen called One Solitary Life. Pastor Sam Watney, still a good friend of mine and a pastor out in Boulder, narrated while the choir sang these words. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another obscure village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never went to college. He never visited a big city. He never traveled more than 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things usually associated with greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. While dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 centuries have come and gone, and today, Jesus is the central figure of the human race, the leader of mankind's progress. All the armies that have ever marched, all the navies that have ever set sail, all the parliaments that have ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned put together on earth have not affected the life of mankind as powerfully as this one solitary life. I was reading in the Gospel of John a verse that I'd like to remind you of. It's absolutely one of the best verses in all of the scriptures when it comes to Jesus. I'm just going to read it. John, very last verse in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verse 25. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. And I just love that because we know enough about Jesus to know what he wants, what he came to do, but there's so much more that one day we'll know. Randy Barnett introduced me to that. The second person I met in high school was a young, beautiful girl who was a drummer. I was a drummer as well. Her name was Cheryl Rose. And there's something very sexy about a girl drummer. So I started to like Cheryl Rose, but I had to stand in line for a long time because there were a lot of guys that liked Cheryl Rose, that wanted to date Cheryl Rose. Finally, I got my chance. I took her on a date. We went to the Ice-Capades. Remember the Ice-Capades? We went to the Ice-Capades, and we got there late because I got lost. And we had a great time. We eventually fell in love. We got married in June of 1978. It turns out a rose, by any other name, I guess, is a Skattum. The third person I met in high school is a young man. He played the trombone. His name was Steve Taylor. Cheryl, my wife-to-be, accompanied him at music competitions. And in early 1982, we were both 25 years old. Steve called me one day out of the blue and asked me if I'd have lunch with him. I suspected he wanted to sell me Amway, but it wasn't that. He invited me to interview, actually, for his current job at this church. He was directing the Christian education and music program at that time under his dad. And he felt the calling by God to launch a career that would be notable in changing the landscape completely of contemporary Christian music and then becoming a filmmaker. Google him sometime. He asked me if I'd take his place while he went on the road to start a career, a music career. I worked then with his dad, or I met his dad, Roland Taylor, an incredible pastor and friend who was the first full-time pastor here at Crossroads Church, assuming the position from the part-time beginning pastor here, A.R. Smith. Roland began being the first full-time pastor in 1963. I interviewed with him and the board, some of whom are still in this church, and they offered me the job to take Steve's place, director of music and Christian education, which basically meant youth. Roland took this inexperienced and cocky 25-year-old kid with a full head of hair and a full beard trimmed nicely. He took me under his arm, and he taught me more than I ever thought was possible. Steve and his parents, Roland and Gail, will actually be at the party this church is throwing for me on January 12th. I hope you'll be a part of it as well. It does really look like a lot of fun. 3 solitary lives that to this day changed my life, and I never knew that was going to happen when I was back in high school. I never dreamed that this church would hire me and actually pay me $17,000 a year to be its youth and music director. I had just graduated a couple years before, in 1979, with a music degree from what is now Colorado Christian University. And I could put my degree to work. I never dreamed that I came here as a young couple married to my young wife, married 4 years. And I would meet so many other young couples in this church who to this day are still my friends. Crossroads Church became an amazing community for my wife and I. I never dreamed that we'd come to this church without any children, infertile for 7 years of our marriage, and now today, stepping away from this role, I have 6 kids. Ministry will do strange things to you. I have 3 beautiful in-laws and 3 grandkids, 2 of whom are with us and 1 of whom is in heaven. I never dreamed that I would love working with students as much as I did at this church for all those years, a decade. I never dreamed, for example, that in 1986, the youth choir that I launched and grew and directed called Upward Bound would be invited to sing at the World's Fair in Vancouver, British Columbia. We loaded a bus, went there, sang. It changed all of our lives. I never dreamed that I'd take on leadership of 2 important ministries here. The Awana program, a long program directed by the Soapers here at this church. I took that on as a commander eventually. And then I led the Sunday school department at this church. And over the course of a few short months, I ground both of them almost to a halt, to dismal numbers, near extinction, until one day my wife came to me and demanded that I turn these programs over to more qualified leadership. I never dreamed that the little Sunday school class that I took on from Gail Taylor with 6 or 8 couples in it way back then, Roland's wife, Gail, had this great class going. She wanted me to take it now. So I tried and I did my best. I went to Roland one day and I said, I think I'm failing at this class. I'm not doing a good job like your wife. And he said, you are you, Gail is Gail. You be you, let Gail be Gail. And that changed me. That little class grew to well over 100 people. We had to move from room to room to room. We named that class from young marrieds. We named it to the NM class, standing for now married, newly married, never married, or never mind. We wanted anybody to come, and dropping a little name, one of our members of that class, there was a couple, Greg and Aaron Smalley. Some of you will recognize Greg's dad, Gary Smalley, who came here and dedicated Greg and Aaron's baby while I was leading that class. It was a highlight. And teaching that class would make me so nervous because I would stand in front of these people and I would try and teach them out of the Bible, and I barely knew what I was talking about. I had very little theological training. So Cheryl and I decided I need to go back to school and get some training. So I started a Master of Divinity degree at Denver Seminary, along with a fellow staff member, Bill Nicholson. And in the fall of 1987, I began that degree. I never dreamed a few years later that in 1992, with just over 300 people attending this church and twice that number calling this their church home, that Roland Taylor would announce his retirement. By the end of 1982, this church needed to find another pastor. Roland graciously came to me and suggested that I apply for his job. I hadn't even graduated from high school yet. I never dreamed that the largest business meeting in the history of this church up to that point would vote me in as their second full-time senior pastor at 35 years old by a vote of 293 to 6. I never dreamed that by my graduation from seminary with my Master's of Divinity degree in 1994, that this church would have doubled in size, that one of the long-term members of this church who happened to vote against me, she was one of the 6, she came to me to apologize and said, it appears that this was God's will. Her name was Margaret Carpenter, the former Thornton mayor, and she was so full of grace and humility. I learned a lot from Margaret Carpenter. I never dreamed that a couple kids from Upward Bound, the youth choir, and a young adult from our small ensemble, New Splendor, would all 3 grow up and become staff members at this church. Brian Thompson, who served at this church and now pastors his own church in Firestone. A young girl named Laura Moody. You know her last name is Brasagini. She directed our children's program for over 2 decades and just herself retired recently. And Mia Ross, better known now as Mia Garneau, who serves this church as our financial secretary. I never dreamed that the child of one of our charter members, Daryl and Nancy Case, Chip Case, over 20 years ago, would leave his management position with Rite Aid and join our staff to become to this very day our business administrator. Or that fellow seminarian, Bruce Bolter, would retire from management level position at Quest Communications and join our staff in significantly leading our staff to this very day. I never dreamed that a random visit to Lloyd and Winnie Martz, our former pastor and wife of visitation here, former pastors themselves who retire into this church, became elderly and moved into assisted living in Broomfield, that one afternoon in the winter, I visited this retired ministry couple, and they said to me at that visit something I never expected that day. They looked at me and they said, "We believe that you're doctorate material." And I laughed and I scoffed, and they were serious. And they wanted me to consider going back to Denver Seminary and getting my Doctor of Ministry degree. That might have been because of what they saw I really needed, but they also realized that it might benefit us and me. And they believed that I could do it so much that they paid for my entire Doctor of Ministry program. And so that's what I did. And I graduated Dr. Kim Skattum in May of 2009. I never dreamed when we started talking and arguing, some of you remember as a church in our business meetings, about the possibility of opening what was kind of unheard of at that point, a counseling center that would be a standalone ministry serving this community over 20 years ago. And I never dreamed that Dr. Ron Veach, by this time a member here and recently retired from the faculty at Metro State College, a highly respected member of the therapeutic and Christian counseling community, I never dreamed that he would agree to be the director of Crossroads Counseling Associates, and just recently retired from that position. I never dreamed that we would outgrow our church building after 3 major remodels to accommodate people, 1977, 1986, and 1995. And by those building expansions, packing out this building across 3 campuses, we need to look for another location. I never dreamed that in 2001 we'd find a location and we'd close on a $3 million, 18-acre piece of land at 128th and I-25 in Thornton, on which we planned to build a big new building to relocate Crossroads Church. I never dreamed that God would change our plans for that building so drastically, from first building a 1,500-seat dedicated auditorium to building a multi-purpose room with a flat floor in which we would conduct our worship services, and do so to this very day. Some of you are sitting in that very room. I never dreamed that God would say, "Oh, and by the way, don't abandon the North Glen campus. Just do multi-campus church." In a day and an age, the early 2000s, when multi-site church was almost unheard of. It was a new concept back then. But we struggled through it, and we made it work, and we worshiped at 2 facilities. I never dreamed that God would bring the right people here at the right time and the right funding to move forward with building that $8 million, 37,000 square foot North Campus. We opened that in 2007. I never dreamed that because of the continuing and faithful giving of this generous church, that by 2016, just a little over 3 years ago, we'd make our final mortgage payment on all of our mortgages, and we would completely be debt-free and celebrate by actually burning that mortgage in the building. I never dreamed that in 2011, Pastor David Graves from the First Baptist Church of Fort Lupton would call me out of the blue and make an appointment. He'd come and sit in my office, and he'd look me directly in the eye, and he said, "We need to become a Crossroads Church campus. Would you adopt us as a campus?" And after much prayer and conversation, by January of 2012, we would all sign the paperwork, and First Baptist Church of Fort Lupton would become Crossroads Church Fort Lupton campus. I never dreamed that I would have the absolute honor of serving this church with dozens and dozens of fantastic and dedicated staff, both paid and volunteer. I never dreamed that we would gain a reputation of being known in this community as a church that serves and cares and loves sacrificially, and that we would make it our official statement, our official mission to serve people toward and connect people to Jesus. I never dreamed that I'd officiate over 350 funerals, some for very dear friends of mine, and officiate nearly 300 weddings, and baptize over 300 people, and dedicate dozens of children, and make hundreds of hospital visits, and nursing home visits, and home visits, and preach over 1,000 sermons. I never dreamed that a young family with 3 sparkling children back in the 90s, a family with the name Manning, would make Crossroads Church their home for a number of years, and they would serve this church diligently before moving their family back to the Midwest. And then one of those children, the oldest, Matthew, would grow up and go to seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, and marry a beautiful bride there, and then choose to do his internship at Crossroads Church back in 2001 under my leadership, only to eventually graduate from that seminary and come back to Crossroads Church, and we hired Matt as our next generation pastor back in 2007. I never dreamed that until we discovered this young man and his capabilities being a lot more than we ever hired him originally to do, a few years later would come to mind when God would be speaking to me about needing to make my transition out. Nearly 6 years ago now, out of senior pastor leadership back in 2014 when this plan became crystallized, and determine a succession plan that would be smooth as a transfer of leadership at this church and an ongoing commitment to its mission and its commitment to our community. And I never dreamed that I would suggest Pastor Matt Manning to become our 3rd full-time senior pastor starting on January 1st, 2020. And I never dreamed that Pastor Matt would take on that role with enthusiasm and wisdom and humility and incredible maturity and vision. And that he would, through this whole 5-year transition plan, show me nothing but incredible honor and respect to this very day. And finally, I never dreamed that through it all, through the joy and through the successes, and most importantly, through the difficult and dark times, and there were plenty of those, one person would stand by me and love me because she loves Jesus. One person that would tell me the truth and defend me with her whole heart. She was that sexy drummer from high school, Cheryl Lynn Skattum, who never dreamed herself that she'd ever become a pastor's wife, and who always thought she never measured up, but without whom I'd never have been able to make it 38 years in this church, in this ministry, in one place. I love her with my entire being. I never dreamed. There's a real good verse in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. The chapter starts this way: "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven." And then you skip down to verse 11, and Solomon writes, "God makes everything beautiful in its time." There are 2 words in the Bible that identify time, and they're both beautiful. One is chronos, and it's the time we measure with our watches and our day timers and our calendars. It's what we celebrate annually on our birthdays. It's what we keep track of with our chronographs. Chronos, time measured by seconds and minutes and weeks and years, decades. The second word the scriptures use is the word kairos. Kairos is a different form of time. It's not time measured by minutes and seconds. It's time measured by moments, by seasons. Both of those words in the Greek translation of this Hebrew text are used in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. For everything there is a chronos, a season, a moment, an event, an epoch, a season of time. For everything there is a season and a chronos, a time. for every matter under heaven. What I've been praying is that through this little journey that you would reflect on your own life and that you would see, and I would ask you to think about your own life, whether you're young or whether you're old. You have, like we all do, 84,600 seconds every day, 365 days a year. And those seconds and minutes and days, time we measure by Chronos, are filled with plans and activities and schedules and duties that our lives require. But as surely as Chronos time clicks away, as surely as we turn each calendar page, God is at work in our Chronos with his Kairos, with his plan, with his moments, with his seasons, where usually the deepest realities and joys and plans of life are shaping us and molding us. Often it's in those Chronos times where God is doing his most important and intimate work. And if we're not careful, if we don't pay attention, if we don't slow down and reflect on those Kairos moments in the middle of our Chronos demands, we'll miss them. And we might miss what God is saying, what he's teaching at the deepest levels of our experience, of our existence, of our lives. Because Kairos is never measured like Chronos. Kairos is measured by moments and seasons and movements that all of a sudden show up while we're living Chronos time. I call them the I never dreamed moments of our lives. Watch for those. Especially watch for those in the darkest moments of your life. For everything, there is a Kairos, a season, and a Chronos, a time for every matter under heaven. God came near. He lived this life so that he could give us life. He stepped into our Chronos so that we could have hope, so that we could find courage and experience a love that is so deep, so forgiving, so merciful, so unconditional, so intimate through every season and every time of our lives. Love we never dreamed was even possible. He makes all things beautiful in its time. Jesus' one solitary life, the eternal stepping into our Chronos, that life changed mine. When I said yes to Jesus, that experience opened my eyes to know God, to receive his forgiveness for my sin, to understand his mercy, and experience his love that always streams my way. And I never dreamed how his life would change everything in mine. Have you said yes to Jesus? You should. Unequivocally, yes, you should. Absolutely. While you have the time, do it. Receive Christ. He will change your life, and he will make it something beautiful in its time. Literally forever. He makes all things beautiful in its time. I never dreamed what my life would become, being a part of what God started at Crossroads Church long before I had gotten here, long before I had that lunch with Steve Taylor. But God knew, and he knows your life as well. And it has been for me absolutely the most challenging and the most incredible experience I could ever imagine. I am so deeply grateful to each one of you, some of whom have been here for decades, some of whom are new here, but I am so grateful for you. And I'm humbled at God's goodness. And I am absolutely, determinedly excited about our future at Crossroads Church, for what our future holds for us. So I would just like to say thank you, Crossroads Church. Thank you for trusting me, for believing in me, for honoring me. The weight of your spiritual journey, of your theological experience that I felt on me is not lost on me. I know that weight every day, every experience, every sermon, every conversation. Thank you for trusting, believing, and honoring me. And thank you in advance for transferring that trust and that faith and that honor to Pastor Matt as he officially takes the helm on Wednesday. He's a proven leader, a man after God's own heart. Please give him the respect and honor and give him the business that you've shown me. I'm absolutely thrilled to be following Matt into our future as part of this church, right alongside of you. And now, I'd like to say a prayer. Would you pray with me? God, as is often the case, I'm at a loss for words to tell you how very grateful I am today for my parents, for my wife, for my family, for this church, for the past nearly 4 decades, for your timing in all of our lives. And mostly I thank you for Jesus, whose one solitary life broke into our world to give us peace and hope and salvation and eternity. I never dreamed. Thank you for that. Thank you. And I pray, we pray, together in the strong name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.